Now, our final speaker of this conference, and it's not really a conference, is it? Event, of this event, wonderful event, is a novelist, a historian, and an archivist. And I just think, with novelists, I kind of fall down in front of them on the ground, thinking how can they bring all these stories together and work so wonderfully with language and whatever. And so our last speaker now today is going to talk. It's Andrew Hughes, who's from Wexford, and he's going to talk about hidden histories, the inspiration found in women's archival collections. And his novel, The Coroner's Daughter, was the One Dublin One Book choice for 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for that introduction. Thanks to Maeve for inviting me here to speak this afternoon. I'm delighted to deliver the final talk. Before the closing remarks, it's such a fascinating seminar. I'm here primarily in my role as an author and a writer of historical fiction, but I started out as an archivist. And looking back, the training I had and the work I've done with various collections has shaped the type of writer that I am. I'm also a historical researcher. I spend much of my time writing the history of Georgian houses and estates. And that research formed the basis of my first book, which was a social history of Fitzwilliam Square called Lives Less Ordinary, which we'll look at a bit later. Just before COVID, I was commissioned to write the history of Callua Castle in County Westmeath, which has been rescued from the brink of ruin by its current owners. This is how the castle appeared in around 2000. It was built by a man called Benjamin Chapman, first baronet in the 1780s. Now, the trouble for somebody like me who had to tell the history of this house was that all the archives related to the estate had been lost. The Chapmans simply died out, the contents of Callua were sold, its papers most likely were consigned to a bonfire. Very few fragments of Chapman correspondence remained in other collections. There was little description of Benjamin Chapman, who was an MP in the Irish House of Commons, except for dry reports and newspaper archives. That's Benjamin there, the thin-faced man peeking above the red box. So it looked as though the beginning of this history was going to be rather bereft. But then, because finding aids these days are text searchable, thank goodness, I stumbled upon a reference to Benjamin and Callua in the Mariah Edgeworth papers in the National Library. So I went in and I loaded the microfilm, found the particular letter from Mariah, who was of course a renowned novelist, to her stepmother dated 1st of May 1806. And she wrote, "At Glenmellan, my father met Sir Benjamin Chapman, who pressed him much to dine. How would not you, dear mother, give sixpence to have seen the scene? Up bold to the baronet, no, not bold, for nothing can be less round, but up came a lathe of a man with a great deal of sharp practice and a disagreeable wizen countenance. Out came a profusion of compliments on back-rent grizzle, then a modest request to dine and sleep, impossible, but would accept of his obliging offer to drive through his grounds. Away trolled his agent to open the gates. The domain of Sir Ben, I believed, is pretty, but I was tired and anxious to get on to Allenstown. Nevertheless, the baronet would not be content till he had walked me through the whole house, parlour, drawing room, library, bedchambers, not excepting his own." She continues a little below, "I was so stupid and anxious to get on, and Sir Benjamin's breath like Kerwin smelt so of garlic or asafoetida. All the time he talked, which he did without stop or stay. I went to the brink of a fib to avoid his invitation to dine with him. As we came back, said we were to dine with Lady Pakenham." Now, her sketch of Sir Benjamin and the house went on for several paragraphs, and I was delighted when I read it. Suddenly, this ghostly shell of a house had come alive. It was a way in for me to tell this story. And while in this case the book I was writing was non-fiction, the same would have been true for historical fiction. Wearing my author's hat, I could easily see this as a scene in a novel, a visit from our heroine to a mildly disagreeable neighbour. And while the context of a fictional story might be different, there would still be so much to glean. The warmth and the humour of her voice, the small descriptive details, the little turns of phrase that can give modern writing a sense of historical authenticity. That's what archives can do. I often speak to fellow writers who say that they shy away from historical fiction. For some, there is a feeling of disconnect to the people of the past, as if we're looking at them through the glass of a museum case. But I suspect that those of us who work with archives, either as custodians or researchers, don't feel that. There's an uncanny sensation when you hold a document that was written by somebody decades or centuries ago. It only takes the smallest leap of imagination to picture that person at a desk, smoothing out that sheet of paper, inscribing these words, and by some fluke of history it has ended up in your hands. My background in archives means that I hardly consider historical fiction to be a distinct genre. They're stories like any other that happen to be set in the past. Just briefly to show the transformation of Kahlua, this is it in its present state. It was just a remarkable transformation effort. The work that I do researching these house histories is mainly possible because of the digitization of archives, the amount of material that is now text searchable and available online. It also means that the inspiration for women's stories can be found in the most fleeting of references. Several years ago, I was asked to research the history of Beulah, a lovely seaside home in Dalkey. A trawl of online archives uncovered this reference in the Irish Law Times for 1876. The wife of Edward Gibson, QC, has given birth to a daughter at Beulah on the 30th of August. Edward Gibson was later the Lord Chancellor of Ireland. A quick search of genealogical records showed that this daughter was named Violet, seen here when she was 17, and some of you may be familiar with the name, for in the fullness of time, Violet would attempt to assassinate Benito Mussolini. In 1926, as he was leaving the College of Surgeons in Rome, Violet approached with a revolver wrapped in a shawl. She fired once, but Mussolini moved his head at the last minute, and the bullet just took a divot out of his nose. She fired again, but this time the bullet jammed, and the mob descended on her. Mussolini declined to press charges. He later said that he wished for a beautiful death, not one at the hands of an ugly old woman. But as we know, Mussolini did not meet with a beautiful death. You can see at the top left of the record, it says that her father was Edward and that she was born in August 76 at Dalkey, Irlanda, which is a nice way of bringing the story full circle. Now, Gibson's exploits were already well known, but I use this as an example of a woman's story that lay hidden in the most mundane of sources. By chance, I had been asked to research Beulah. I stumbled upon this run-of-the-mill birth announcement in a paper, and with a little digging, a sweeping drama suddenly opened up in front of me. It's just the case that these stories are out there, we just have to go looking for them. I was inspired by a similar online trawl when it came to writing my second novel, The Coroner's Daughter. I knew that I wanted to set the book in 1816. I knew I wanted the main character to be a young woman, since she would need plausible access to cases of murder. The idea of Abigail Lawless and The Coroner's Daughter came to be. I then set about looking for transcripts from coroner's courts in the early 19th century and came upon the following rather distressing tale of a young nursemaid who was accused of murdering her newborn. The London Medical Gazette reported, "A young female in the service of Mr. Nesham has been charged with the murder of her infant child." A little further down it says, "In the forenoon she retired to bed unwell, and at night, she being still in bed, Mr. Nesham taxed her with being in the family way." Eventually the maid admitted that there was a body of a child beneath her bed, and at the bottom it's reported, "He said to her he hoped she had used no violence to the child. 'Oh, sir,' she replied, 'you will see.' He found the body of a male child wrapped in a rug, the throat cut, and a penknife lying on the breast." Now, what struck me in particular about this report was that the coroner had carried out a test called a hydrostatic test, in which the lungs of the infant were suspended in water, the belief being that if the baby had taken a breath, the lungs would be aerated and buoyant, and in that case, it would be a case of willful murder. In the novel, Abigail's father carries out this hydrostatic test while Abigail is present. It was the opening scene of the book, and some of the language came directly from the report we just looked at. A few lines down, Mr. Lawless said, "Before he asked the authorities to trawl the city basin, Mr. Nesham decided it best to search the maid's room. The child was discovered wrapped in a rug and concealed beneath the bed. As Mr. Nesham unfolded the bundle, he said to the girl that he hoped she had done no violence to the child, and she replied, 'Oh, sir, you will soon see.' He found the boy with his throat cut and a penknife lying on his breast." There was another poignant detail in the report that we just looked at a minute ago. It stated, "Since the inquest was held, an important discovery has been made. A fellow servant, in seeking out a change of linen for the prisoner, has found several articles of baby linen among her clothes, with also a quantity of new flannel and calico, evidently intended for the expected event." In the novel, I had Abigail visit the Nesham home and sneak into the maid's room, and it is she who makes that discovery. Inside the wardrobe, the maid's clothes hung from a rail, and her undergarments were stacked on shelves. The corner of a wicker basket peeked from behind a bundle of petticoats. It held knitting materials, balls of wool and needles, newly made articles of baby clothes, as well as flannels and calico. A tiny cardigan of light grey wool was unfinished, the needle inserted in the looped stitches, a trail of yarn attached to the ball still unsnipped. I looked over to the bed and imagined the maid working by candlelight during the cold evenings, hastily concealing the basket whenever anyone entered the room. I delved through some of the completed items, stockings and mittens, coats and hoods, hours and hours of labour. How could the girl's intentions towards her child have changed so drastically? And the point is that it is not only full archival collections that can inspire novelists. The research we do means that we are immersed in newspaper archives, scientific journals, religious tracts, collections of letters. We're always on the lookout for a nugget that can inspire a scene or a certain character or a plot point. We're very much magpies in that regard. I had set up another example, but it was pretty much telling the same thing, how an original source can provide details that would then make its way into the novel. But slightly conscious of time, I will skate past that. As mentioned earlier, my first book was called Lives Less Ordinary. In it, I looked at all of the inhabitants of Fitzwilliam Square, and there were any number of tales involving fascinating women which could make for compelling historical fiction. Take number 5 Fitzwilliam Square, for example, which in 1919 was owned by Margaret McGarry, a remarkable woman who was one of the founding members of Cumann na mBan, a courier for the volunteers during the Easter Rising, and later a Sinn Féin councillor in Dublin Corporation. I wonder if Margaret McGarry featured in Mná 100 at all. At the start of the War of Independence, she was asked by ministers of the First Dáil for permission to use her house, number 5 Fitzwilliam Square, as a meeting place and a safe house. In February 1921, the house was raided, and the circumstances were described by Margaret's daughter Maeve in her witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, which is some 1,800 witness accounts from veterans of the Irish Revolutionary period. I'm not sure how many of those statements were made by women. Perhaps Sinead would have more knowledge about that, but I'm sure that there are dozens and dozens of them. Once again, it's a fantastic resource. It's text searchable, my 2 favourite words, and it's full of compelling stories such as the following. This is Maeve McGarry, daughter of Margaret McGarry. She wrote, "My mother was in the corporation and a councillor for the Fitzwilliam ward since 1919. She had just come home from a meeting and was having a cup of tea talking to the housekeeper when the military broke in. She had an important paper in her bag and wondered where she could hide it. She stuck it down her blouse. She concluded from the intensity of the raids on the Fitzwilliam Street and Square houses that the castle had some reliable information. Fresh reinforcements of armoured cars kept coming along, so she uttered a fervent prayer, put on her hat and coat, walked coolly down the stairs, though the military and auxiliaries were in every room and on the stairs. They had burst in the back and come up the garden. And she passed through the midst of them out the door. She could not make it out at all. They did not seem to see her. She said herself it was a miracle in answer to her prayer. She went by tram straight out to Loughnavale on the Strand. Loughnavale was another house she owned where she knew that De Valera was staying that night. But once again, with my author's hat on, here's a scene that has almost written itself. In fact, it strikes me as an ideal scene for a movie or TV show. We can just picture a tracking shot as Margaret McGarry walks serenely through this chaos of an armed raid, rooms being ransacked, soldiers blundering past, and all the while the very thing they're searching for is hidden in her blouse. Maeve's statement continued, "They also searched every room and questioned everyone in the main house of number 31, that was 31 Fitzwilliam Street, but found nothing there, although Fiona Plunkett and I and an engineering student called Harnett had hidden some grenades and ammunition under the boards in the bathroom. I have one of the grenade cases still as a memento." Pictured here is Fiona Plunkett from an RTE still. I have to say, she does not strike me as the type of woman who would hide grenades under floorboards, but I suppose needs must. But the detail mentioned here could also provide inspiration for a fiction writer. I can just imagine someone wishing to tell the story of Fiona Plunkett or Maeve McGarry or a character based on them, using a framing device whereby we start the book in the 1950s in an ordinary 2 up, 2 down. A Dublin housewife is going about her work, kids are bawling in the background, and while looking for something, she rummages in a little used drawer and pulls out a grenade case. And suddenly memories from 30 years before would come flooding back. There's no telling where inspiration will come from or what archival nugget will spark an idea. And if we wish for women's stories to be told more widely, then the dissemination of women's archives and the work of custodians and curators is vital. Only recently, an exhibition entitled 5 Women, 5 Moments was in Maynooth University, curated by Roisin Berry and Ciara Joyce, and it showcased the type of material that is available. Of the 5 collections featured, the one that struck me in particular related to the dramatist Teresa Deevy. a Waterford woman, one of 13 sisters, which could be a novel on its own. She became deaf when she was 19, and her plays were produced in the Abbey Theatre in the 1930s. But for a modern novelist wishing to tell her story, what could be better than to be immersed in Deevy's letters, her draft writings, and as seen here, the ephemera from the Abbey Theatre? And I believe that there's an appetite for such stories. Two recent historical novels featuring the lives of Irish women are A Quiet Tide by Marianne Lee, which is a reimagining of the life of the 19th century botanist Ellen Hutchins, and Nora by Nuala O'Connor, the One Dublin One Book for 2022, which was a portrait of Nora Barnacle, James Joyce's wife and muse. I've heard Marianne Lee speak of the depth of research in Ellen Hutchins' correspondence and botanical drawings and how that helped her own writing. I was fully sure that the same would be true of Nora with regards to her correspondence with Joyce, but then I read a piece by Nuala O'Connor in the Paris Review in which she wrote, "Whenever I told anyone I was writing a bio-fictional novel about Nora and Joyce, they would remark with glow-eyed glee, 'Oh, no doubt you'll include the letters.' And yes, I have included them, but not quite as you might think. The first challenge for me as a novelist was that the letters are still under copyright. The second challenge was that Nora's half of the correspondence was not available, missing, perhaps destroyed, and I had to fill in those gaps with imagined letters of my own. I mimicked Joyce's letters as closely as I could. I wrote Nora's part of the correspondence using Joyce's letters as a call and response guide. When he praised her for using certain stimulating phrases and words, I included them in her letters to him in the voice I had invented for her." And I think that is an interesting point on which to conclude. For all the inspiration that a fiction writer can take from stories, from women's stories in archival collections and online resources, our job, first and foremost, is to make stuff up, to fill in the gaps, to speculate, as long as that speculation is grounded in as many facts as possible, and in the end, hopefully, to tell a gripping and compelling tale. As these collections become more accessible and more celebrated, the stories of remarkable women will propagate, and with the success that Irish writers and filmmakers are having at the moment, chances are that some will meet with a very wide audience. Thank you very much.